Okay, joining me now is a man who obviously needs no introduction. He is one of the leading conservative minds and thinkers, really, of the last 50 years. You know him, you love him, nationally syndicated columnist, best-selling author, Patrick J. Buchanan. Pat, thank you so much for coming on the Cooner Report.
Delighted, Jeff. Delighted to be here.
Pat, I've got to ask you straight out of the box. Your last column was, don't trash the Iran nuclear deal. President Trump essentially has just trashed the nuclear deal. What's your reaction? What's your response?
I think it's a terrible mistake on the part of the president pulling out of this right now. Following that, of course, they've called for canceling the deal whereby we sold $40 billion worth of Airbus planes and Boeing planes to Iran. I don't know where we're headed, Jeff, other than down the road to where the president makes demands on Iran to which it says no, and new demands. And I think at the end of that road, there's a real possibility of a war, which Donald Trump said he would not get America into.
Okay, now, Pat, that's to me the central question. Why do you think by pulling out of this deal, I don't want to say guarantees, but significantly increases the chances of us going to war with Iran? Why do you see that happening?
I see it for this reason. The president's pulled out of the deal. I think Iran is going to stick with the deal by and large, especially if the Europeans don't impose sanctions, but the Americans may force them to deal with it. But I think this, in terms of the war, I think Israel wants a war with Iran in Syria to drive the Iranians out of Syria. The Saudis would like to see the United States fight Iran. And I think what we're going to get is Israeli action against Iranian elements in Syria. We saw that just yesterday. And I think what happens when the shooting starts back and forth and the Iranians respond after being provoked, we're going to have an increase in violence in Syria between Iranians and Israelis. And I think the United States almost inevitably will be sucked into that on the side of Israel. I don't know how you solve this problem currently going on in Syria without basically a stand down of all the forces that are there.
Pat, but just to play devil's advocate for a second, I'm sure you've heard these arguments, but I just want to see what your response is. If we did stay in the Iran deal, the proxy war, the shadow war, whatever you want to call it, between Iran and Israel in Syria would still continue. There would still be missile strikes, right, on Iranian positions or Iranian bases. So if the proxy war continues, even if we're in the deal, if that leads to a war between Iran and Israel, we would get sucked in anyway. What do you say to that argument?
I would say to that argument this. President Trump said he was going to get us out of Syria. I would tell the Israelis point blank, obviously, if you are attacked by Iranian troops in Syria, we're with you. But you are not going to be able to start a war that drags the United States into a brand new war in Syria. We are not going in. To me, the Iranian nuclear deal is a good deal in this sense. Iran doesn't have a bomb. It hasn't been working on a bomb since 2003. It's got all its centrifuges. The number of those has been reduced. Its uranium's out of the country. It is something on which to build. I think the way we were going, which is basically, but under the late Obama administration, of engaging with Iran and trying to work with them diplomatically, was the way to go. Of all the things that could happen there, I think a real disaster would be the United States being sucked into that Syrian civil war against Iranian forces, and then maybe against Syrian forces, and then maybe Hezbollah acting up against Israel. I don't know what the Russians would do. I know they don't want a war with the United States, but I think Trump's instincts to get us out of Syria are dead right.
Pat, what do you say to the argument that the deal gave the mullahs over $100 billion in unfrozen assets, $2 billion almost in cash, It does nothing on their ballistic missile program. It does nothing about their funding of terrorists across the Middle East. And then you have Bibi Netanyahu with his presentation saying that he says he's got evidence through Mossad that the Iranians continue to have a clandestine nuclear weapons program and that they've played us for fools. What do you say to those arguments?
If the Iranians have a clandestine nuclear weapons program right now, an active program, then all the U.S. intelligence agencies ought to be called to account and their leaders fired, because they have told us in 2007 and in 2011 Iran has no active nuclear bomb program. It does not have a bomb program. That's one thing. What were the other questions you asked on the $100 billion? That money is gone. As for the missile operation, as for restrictions on Iranian missiles, I think that's worth negotiating with the Europeans and with others to say, look, if you have no nuclear weapons, there's no need for an intermediate-range ballistic missile that can go 2,500 miles or a long-range ballistic missile that can hit the United States. If you start building one of those and it's not conspicuously to put satellites into orbit, and the nose cone looks like it's for a nuclear weapon, we will destroy those missiles. We'll be happy to negotiate a deal with you. But I don't see what you accomplish at all by taking off Iran the restrictions that have been imposed upon Iran, in which they have scrupulously met, according to every inspector, according to the Europeans, IAEA, and all the rest. Why would you risk that? You've got something with the Iranian deal. The money is gone. We're not going to get it back. It wasn't our money. And frankly, $40 billion apparently was going to be spent on commercial airliners. We could have gotten that $40 billion back.
Pat, when Bibi made that presentation, what do you make of his presentation? Was he trying to convince the United States to come in on behalf of Israel against Iran?
I think it was orchestrated.
Okay, now why do you think that?
Well, because I think Pompeo was there. There was strikes about that time. It was. Why did Bibi get up and do it all at night in Israel in English?
Oh,
why didn't he use Hebrew if it's with his own people?
So you're saying that his audience was obviously the American audience,
right,
not the Israeli audience.
Ron almost.
All right. So Pat, then I've got to ask you then this ultimate question: do you think Trump's strategy, and he's a deal maker, he's a negotiator, is to pull out of the deal because ultimately he wants to renegotiate a better deal? One would say no sunset provisions, ones that puts ballistic missiles on the table in terms of a negotiation. Is that his strategy, to maybe pull out, have the Europeans act as a conduit, and then come back and say, look, you guys don't want nuclear weapons? Fine, let's get a new deal. Is that possibly his thinking?
The Iranians say, look, we trusted you. We did exactly what you said here. We would be willing to talk about a follow-on deal. But the idea that you walk away from the deal and you renege on what you promised, the answer is no, we don't want to negotiate a new deal with you. So what do we do then? What is the alternative then? Issue an ultimatum and go to war?
What if Trump just status quo? In other words, we've pulled out.
Well, then how has he said to me, in other words, we give up a nuclear deal which restricts their production of uranium and their centrifuges. All of these restrictions go off because we walked away from the deal, and then we do nothing? I mean, that means that Iran could be much closer to a nuclear weapon than they were under the deal. If there's no follow-on deal, and Iran walks out of this and starts re-enriching uranium, and this time not to 20%, but to 90% weapons grade, what do we do then?
Pat, so I don't want to put you now in the role of a prophet. You're obviously a commentator, you're an analyst, you're an historian.
Let's go with the prophet.
But let's go. What do you think the likelihood is? What is the percentage of us going to war with Iran after this decision, in your view?
Look, the neocons, Bolton, Bibi Netanyahu, the Saudis, all the others, they see Iran rising in the Middle East, and they want it dealt with, militarily, and they know they may not be able to do it all by themselves, so they want to conscript the United States of America to come and do it for them. And what do I think is, I think what Bibi's going to do, he's going to keep provoking the Iranians in Syria with bombing attacks, killing them, until they respond. And when they respond, you're going to get a great cry from the Beltway here and the neocons and the War Party and everyone. We've got to go to the defense of our Israeli allies. And then we're going to be in another new Middle East war, a much larger war than before, much more damaging to the world economy because you have real problems in the Persian Gulf and with oil. And I think eventually that puts at real risk a presidency that I supported. I think it's just a terrible, terrible mistake.
Pat, you wrote in your last column that America's strategic challenge, as you put it, is not Russia, it's not Iran, it's not even North Korea. If there is any country, it is China. Do you think if we go to war, God forbid, we go to war in the Middle East against Iran, that this will so bleed and bankrupt America that the ultimate winner will be China?
Well, I think certainly. Who's the ultimate winner from 18 years of Middle East wars in Afghanistan and in Iraq and in Libya and in Yemen and in Syria? All the bloodshed, all the diversion, all the cost of these trillion-dollar wars, the forever wars. We're going to continue this. What has China done? China has gone from being a country smaller than Italy at the beginning of this century to a strategic power and an economic power to rival the United States. I think what China will do is, if you ostracize Iran, they will reach out to the Iranians and try to establish stronger relations with them. I think they will stay out of any conflict if we get into the Middle East. And while we're settling and putting the Middle East together and recreating Vermonts and Iowas out there in the Middle East, I think they will be growing, strengthening. If you wanted to bet, given the way we're headed, if you wanted to bet on one country who's going to be dominate the century by the mid-century, I think it would be China.
Pat, you've been very gracious with your time, and I know we're up against it, but I do want to ask you one final question, and it's not about Iran. You wrote an absolutely, really a brilliant column. I think maybe the best column on the topic so far. And that was your column on, I think it came out on Friday, about Robert Mueller. And your advice to the president is, and you're a big supporter of the president, is defy any subpoena. If Mueller wants to force you, compel you to testify, basically tell him, go fly a kite. Why?
Well, this is very simple. The special prosecutor cannot indict a sitting president of the United States. And if he declares the president a target, he can't. Then Trump would not have to answer a subpoena. But he's the president of the United States. He's the leader. What he should say, no, I'm not going to sit down and talk with you at all. I'm not going to follow your subpoena. The special prosecutor will go up to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court may say he has to do it. I would say, if Trump, I would say, I don't care. That's the third branch of government. They cannot tell the President of the United States to have to force him to testify before a member of the executive branch of the United States, which I control. Secondly, if I'm a target of the special prosecutor, I could just say, I'm not going over and testify against myself. And then what is Mueller going to do? What you tell Mueller is, go ahead, I'm not going to testify, wrap up your investigation. If you got something on me that's justified my removal, it's got to be sent to the House of Representatives, which is the only institution that can indict me, and the Senate's the only one that can convict and remove me, so impeach and be damned.
And Pat, as you lay out in your column, you're right. The only institution that could prosecute the president is Congress.
Right.
And you're saying,
do you want Congress? Congress can subpoena documents too. I won't give them. They can impeach me. There's no doubt about that. That's the Constitution. I will follow that.
And Pat, and I think it was a brilliant argument. Take it from the legal terrain, as you put it, or the legal ground, to the political terrain, where Trump is much stronger. And then if you do have an impeachment fight in Congress, and I think you're dead on about this, you're not just going to hear about the Russia narrative and Russiagate, you're going to hear about that FBI cabal. You're going to hear about how they tried to bring down Trump and essentially overturn the election. And Pat, I want to read this one final paragraph. I thought it was so powerful. And speaking of being a prophet, I think it's a warning. I think it's a fire bell in the night. Quote, Basically, you're daring them. You want to impeach him? Go ahead. We'll fight it out in Congress. The whole country, the whole world will be looking. And here's what you say. Trump is a nationalist who puts America first, both in trade and securing her frontiers against an historic invasion from the South. If he is overthrown and the agenda for which America voted is trashed as well, it may be middle America in the streets this time. Pat, are you saying that if they go for impeachment and try to overthrow this president, a duly elected president, you may actually see his supporters this time go out on the streets and massive civil unrest?
I think there's a real possibility. You heard that judge down there in Virginia. He said, what are you doing with this Manafort stuff going back to 2005 or 2010? This is clearly designed to flip him and to get him to testify against the President of the United States and basically to remove the President from office and impeach him. In other words, this is a political machine and they're using legal methodology. If you can move it out of the realm of the legal, which I've described, by defying these subpoenas and say, go ahead, once you put it into the House of Representatives, then the Republicans can call their witnesses. They can call and inquire of Comey. Why did he let Hillary go? They can call in McCabe and all the rest of them. They can bring up the British spy and what he did. Who were the Russians you talked to? All the rest of this stuff, and show that this is okay. You can accuse Trump of allegedly being in collusion with the Russians. A, you got to prove that, and B, we're going to prove the case that you all have been colluding to overthrow an elected president of the United States. So both sides represent your cases before the House, and let the American people decide. And if you impeach me, send it over to the Senate for trial. But just tell them, look, we're ready. We're ready to go out in the street on this thing, and that's what he ought to do. And I do think this. I do think, in a way, there's an indispensable quality to Trump, as he's the only figure who has really stood up against the invasion of America from the South and done something to stop it. He's the only one that's tried to halt these trade deals and trade policies that have cost us all these industries and jobs and investment and factories. And I had hoped, and this is one reason I'm so concerned about this Iranian thing, I had hoped he would be the president to disengage us from these wars that have bled and bankrupted us. And I fear that he's getting himself into another one. I'm hard for me to see, Jeff, how you avoid some kind of collision when there are people in the Middle East and in this country who want that war.
Pat, I urge everybody, go to Buchanan.org. I go there. I read every column of his religiously. He's my favorite columnist, has been for, I think, 30 years now, Pat. Pat, dynamite stuff. Also, he's got a book out. We had him on about it, but I urge you, if you haven't bought it, please buy it. Nixon's White House Wars. It's an absolute gem. Pat, thank you so much, my friend, and hopefully we can have you on again in the future.
Well, thank you, Jeff. Appreciate it.
God bless you. Take care.